In 2022, newly elected Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made big promises. Department of the PM, Albanese Government will create a kinder Australia for all. SBS, Anthony Albanese promises to unite Australia with vision of optimism as new Prime Minister. I wonder how that message of unity worked out for him. In his first year in office, due to his regular jaunts overseas, he was playfully known as Airbus Albo. Airbus Albo refuses to fly commercial. A couple of years later, it was reported by the BBC, Australian PM accused of seeking upgrades from Qantas boss, his mate, Joyce. Don't worry, the ABC came to his rescue. Anthony Albanese defends free Qantas upgrades, stating all have been declared. In 2023, Albo donned his Akubra and set his sights on unifying the nation by pushing the divisive Indigenous Voice to Parliament. The premise was simple: create a permanent platform for some Australians to influence federal government decisions and laws. The problem was only people of a certain ethnicity would be allowed to participate, while the rest of us wouldn't have had the same powers. Yes, the idea was dumb, and despite Albo and his rich Qantas mates pushing for us to vote yes, the majority of Australians said shut up Albo and voted no. Anthony Albanese calls for unity after Australians resoundingly vote down Indigenous Voice to Parliament. In 2024, under the careful watch of Albo's unifying government, Australia saw some of the worst pro-Palestinian protests, with some turning violent. Even Albanese's Marrickville office was abandoned by his staff as protesters covered his office in flags and signs calling for a free Palestine. PM refuses to comment as Gaza protest outside Marrickville office enters sixth week. Protesters somehow scaled the most secure building in the country, Parliament House, and held a protest on the roof. Protesters somehow got inside the building where a Labor state conference was being held, with security guards having to hold the doors shut from the other side. Victorian Labor State Conference stormed by pro-Palestinian protesters as venue locked down. And of course, all the anti-Semitic attacks, with synagogues being targeted. SBS, too little too late, Anthony Albanese heckled during visit to Melbourne synagogue. Ah yes, Albo's unified Australia. And of course, to finish up 2024, we can't forget Albo's massive home purchase. While regular Australians were struggling to pay the rent, he was off buying clifftop mansions for his fiancée, with the ABC commenting, "The Prime Minister's new beach house has just made his job and his colleagues much harder." Now that 2025 has finally rolled around and an election is looming, PM Albo finally decided to release some policy proposals, such as federal Labor promises $500 million for women's health, including better access to long-term contraceptives. As I mentioned in a previous video, men in Australia are actually worse off with regards to health compared to women. But in the name of unifying Australia, Albo decides to throw money at the healthier sex. And of course, I forgot to mention Labor's election promise from a few years ago to reduce power bills by $275. Spoiler alert, it never happened. So how has this last few years of mismanagement of Australia affected the polls? According to The Australian, news poll, majority and mood for change after just one term of Labor, hung Parliament looms. The polling shows that since around the time of the failed Voice referendum in October 2023, the primary vote for Labor is tracking downwards. Ordinarily, the ABC would be on Albo's side, but even they see the writing on the wall. Albanese in trouble as polling shows Dutton most likely to be next PM. In a YouGov poll of more than 40,000 Australians, the LNP will almost certainly pick up more seats than Labor. Albo would have to pull some sort of Houdini trick to win this election. It's not impossible, but it would be very unlikely. The ABC continued their attacks. TikTok is crucial for Gen Z voters, and the PM is losing the battle. Interestingly, in a desperate attempt to improve his odds, Albo has recruited one of Australia's most loathed politicians, former Premier of Victoria Daniel Andrews, who somehow won the state election 3 times from a Stockholm Syndrome-affected population. noting that Melbourne was one of the most locked down places in the world during the pandemic. Brisbane Times, Anthony Albanese calls on Daniel Andrews for help debating Dutton. Anyway, you get the idea. Albanese is on the nose. I kind of feel for him. Kind of. With this failed voice referendum, with this call for more funding for women, with his LGBT pride marches, he just wants to help people. However, by focusing on minority groups, he's forgetting what makes a good democratic leader: listening to the majority. The majority are suffering. GDP is barely growing, and it's only slightly positive due to immigration and government spending. Retail sales are abysmal. Insolvencies are at record levels, and households have suffered the biggest fall in disposable income in more than half a century. There's a cost of living crisis. Housing is unaffordable, and a growing number of households are in financial stress. If the PM just focused on these issues, people would continue voting for him, but instead he plays identity politics. Doesn't he realise that if he helped fix the Australian economy, he'd be helping everyone, including minority groups? But no, he'd rather pander to minorities than just getting on with the simple democratic premise of majority rule.